The war ended on paper before it ended in the dirt. That was the first thing Elijah Booker understood as he walked south with the sun burning the back of his neck and the weight of his rifle pulling at his shoulder. Appomattox had been weeks ago, flags had been furled, generals had shaken hands, but the land itself had not agreed. The roads were still scarred by wagon ruts and blood-dark stains. Burned chimneys rose from fields like broken teeth. Crows gathered where men had fallen and never risen again. But wait for a second before we continue towards the video. Let us know in the comments which country you're watching from and what time of day it is for you. And don't forget to subscribe. Elijah had marched north as an enslaved man who barely owned his own breath. He returned wearing Union blue, patched and faded, but still a uniform. The brass buttons were dulled, the wool torn at the elbows, the cuffs stained with sweat and gun oil. Yet when people saw it, they saw something new, and something dangerous. A black man who had learned how to fight. His boots were mismatched, one taken from a dead Confederate outside Petersburg, the other issued in a camp that no longer existed. Every step reminded him that the war had been stitched together by scavenging and survival. His rifle was older than he was, the stock cracked near the butt, the barrel nicked and darkened from too many cleanings done in haste. He knew its balance as well as he knew his own hands. The countryside shifted as he walked. Fields that once grew cotton lay choked with weeds. Fences leaned inward as if tired of standing. Plantation houses loomed in the distance, some burned, some untouched, all silent. Silence was never empty. Elijah had learned that in the trenches. Silence was a held breath. He passed a group of white men outside a crossroads tavern near dusk. They stopped talking when they saw him. One spat into the dirt. Another rested his hand on the grip of a pistol that looked too new for honest work. Elijah did not slow. He did not look at them. The rifle stayed on his shoulder, not threatening, not hidden, just present. That was enough. Whispers followed him down the road. Some were curses, some were prayers. Most were fear wearing different faces. He had been born on a plantation not far from the Yazoo River, sold twice before the age of 20. He remembered the sound of the whip more clearly than his mother's voice. He remembered the overseer's boots, polished and cruel, and the way a man learned to count pain in breaths instead of seconds. Those memories had not faded in war. They had sharpened. When Union recruiters came through Mississippi, Elijah had not asked permission. He had run at night, feet bleeding, heart hammering louder than the dogs behind him. He reached the lines half-starved and shaking, but alive. They gave him a rifle, then a number, then a place in a regiment that was always sent where the fighting was thickest. He learned quickly how to load under fire, how to move when the air screamed, how to read terrain like a language. Most of all, he learned that fear could be mastered. Not erased, never erased, but controlled, turned into something useful. By the end of the war, he had seen men die who had sworn they were immortal. He had seen boys cry for mothers who would never know where their bones lay. He had learned that orders mattered, but conscience mattered more. Now the orders were gone. The road bent toward the land that had once owned him. Elijah slowed, not from doubt, but from caution. Smoke rose from a cluster of cabins near the tree line. Freedmen, most likely. He could hear voices, low, tense. Laughter did not come easily anymore. As he approached, a woman stepped out, holding a child against her hip. Her eyes widened at the sight of him, not in fear, in disbelief. "Union," she said, almost to herself. He nodded once. "War's done." She laughed, a short sound that broke halfway through. "They say that. But the riders come at night. Overseers, too. Say we still owe them." Elijah looked at the cabins, the men standing just out of sight, watching him from behind doors and trees. He felt the old anger rise, hot and familiar. He pressed it down. "Where?" he asked. She gestured with her chin toward the west. Plantation still standing, same men, same guns. Elijah stayed the night. He did not promise anything. Promises had been broken too many times to be thrown around lightly. He sat by the fire, cleaned his rifle slowly, methodically. The children watched him like he was something pulled from a story. One of the men asked where he had fought. Elijah answered simply. Names of battles carried weight. They deserved respect. Before dawn, he left. The plantation rose out of the mist like a memory refusing to die. White columns stained with soot, windows dark, horses stamped in the yard. Elijah counted men without looking directly, 3 by the barn, 2 on the porch, 1 pacing with a whip coiled loose in his hand. An overseer. Elijah recognized the posture instantly. The man saw him, laughed. "Boy, you lost?" Elijah stopped at the edge of the yard. He did not raise his rifle. He did not lower it either. "War's over," Elijah said. His voice was calm. That unsettled them more than shouting would have. The overseer snorted. "Ain't no war here. You got no business." Elijah stepped forward. Just 1 step. The sound of his boot on packed earth was loud in the quiet morning. "I do," he said. Something shifted. One of the men by the barn moved his rifle higher. Another hesitated. They had faced enslaved men before, they had faced fear. This was different. This man stood like someone who had already seen death and decided it did not own him. "You turn back," the overseer said, but the confidence was gone. Elijah looked past him toward the fields where people would soon be forced to work under threats dressed up as contracts. He thought of the trenches, of the men who had fallen beside him, believing their sacrifice meant something. "No," Elijah said. There was a long moment when the world seemed to wait. A bird took flight. A horse snorted. Then Elijah lifted his rifle, not to aim, but to rest the butt on the ground, both hands folded over the barrel. "I won't fire," he said, "not today, but you will." He held their eyes as he spoke. He saw understanding dawn, slow and terrible. If they shot him, they would have to live with it. If they didn't, they would have to change. The overseer's hand trembled on the whip. Finally, he stepped back. "Get off my land," he muttered, but it was a retreat dressed as command. Elijah turned and walked away. He did not hurry. He did not look back. By the time he reached the road again, word was already moving faster than he could. A black soldier had stood up to a plantation and lived. A man who did not beg. A man who did not bow. By nightfall, overseers were locking doors that had never known fear. By dawn, Elijah Booker had a name spoken quietly across the countryside. And the war, for some, was just beginning. The first overseer disappeared 3 nights after Elijah Booker walked away from the plantation. No gunshots were heard, no alarms raised. By morning, his horse was found wandering near the tree line, reins dragging, saddle empty. The whip he never went anywhere without lay coiled in the dust like a dead snake. Men searched the woods, shouting his name, pistols drawn, bravado forced and brittle. They found nothing, not blood, not a body, not even tracks that made sense. By sundown, the search stopped. Fear, Elijah knew, spread faster when it was allowed to breathe. He had not killed the man, not then. Violence used carelessly had a way of poisoning everything it touched. The war had taught him that power did not always come from pulling a trigger. Sometimes it came from choosing not to, and making sure the other man understood why. Elijah moved like someone who had learned to survive behind enemy lines. He slept during the day in cane thickets or abandoned smokehouses. He traveled at night, following creek beds, keeping to shadows that remembered his shape. He'd learned how to read the land by sound, the difference between wind and leaves and boots and brush, between an owl's call and a signal meant for human ears. By the second night, word had already reached the neighboring plantations. Overseers rode in pairs now. Some carried rifles instead of whips. Others drank more than usual, trying to drown the feeling that something had changed and they were no longer on the winning side of it. Elijah watched them from a distance, memorizing habits. Who rode hard, who lagged behind, who checked their surroundings and who trusted old rules that no longer applied. He did not announce himself. He let imagination do the work. On the third night, he followed 2 overseers who had ridden out to remind a group of freedmen about a labor contract written in ink but enforced with threats. Elijah arrived after they left. He found the men shaken, one nursing a split lip, another clutching his ribs like they might spill out if he let go. "They said we owed," one of them told Elijah, voice tight with humiliation and rage. "Said the law was on their side." Elijah knelt, looked the man in the eyes. "Law's catching up," he said, "but it walks slow. Until it gets here, keep your people close. Don't meet them alone. Don't run." "Running's all we know," the man said. Elijah stood, then learned something new. That night, one of the overseers felt a rifle barrel pressed gently but unmistakably into the hollow beneath his jaw as he dismounted behind his own barn. A voice spoke from the dark, calm as a prayer. "Drop it." The whip fell first, then the pistol. Elijah stepped just enough into the lantern light for the man to see the blue of his coat. "You remember me," Elijah said. The overseer nodded, sweat rolling down his face. "You said you wouldn't fire." "I said not that day." Elijah took the man's gun, unloaded it, and placed it carefully on the ground. Then he leaned close enough that the overseer could smell gun oil and damp wool. "You don't ride out anymore," Elijah said. "You don't raise your voice. You don't touch anyone who doesn't belong to you because no one belongs to you now." The overseer swallowed. "And if I do?" Elijah's eyes were steady. "Then the next man who disappears won't leave a horse behind." He let the overseer go, let him run. Let him tell the story in a voice that shook too much to sound brave. By the end of the week, 3 overseers had quit. One claimed illness. Another packed up in the night and headed east. The third stayed, but never rode again, never lifted a whip, never looked a freedman in the eye without flinching. Plantation owners complained to one another in drawing rooms that smelled of old money and newer fear. They talked about law and order, about outside agitators, about how the world had gone mad. But when they sent men to investigate, those men returned early, pale and quiet. Elijah did not stay in one place long enough to be cornered. He moved between communities like a rumor that learned how to walk. Sometimes he showed himself. Sometimes he let only the consequences be seen. A rifle found bent and useless. A lock smashed clean through without anything taken. A warning carved into a fence post, "Leave them be." Freedmen began to stand straighter when they heard his name. Mothers slept lighter but longer. Children stopped starting at every sound. It was not safety. Not yet, but it was space, and space allowed people to breathe. One evening, Elijah returned to the cabins where he had first stayed. The woman who had spoken to him before met him with a nod that carried gratitude and worry in equal measure. "They say men are coming," she said. "More than before." Elijah nodded. He had heard it too. Former Confederates, men with nothing left but anger and rifles, gathering under the excuse of restoring order. They called themselves posses, committees, patrols. The names changed, the intent did not. How many, he asked? 5, maybe 6. Elijah looked at the cabins, at the men who had learned to keep watch, at the women who had learned to load rifles quietly, at the children who knew which direction to run if things went bad. "Then we don't wait," Elijah said. They did not meet the posses head on. That would have been what the men expected and prepared for. Instead, Elijah led them through what he knew best, uncertainty. A false trail laid toward the river, a campfire lit and abandoned, shots fired from too far away to aim at anyone but close enough to unsettle nerves. By dawn, the posses were arguing among themselves, blaming poor leadership, bad information, traitors. They returned home tired, angry, and unsure. That was when the second overseer vanished. This time there was no horse, just an empty porch, a door swinging in the breeze. A plantation owner who sat down hard and stayed there, staring at nothing. Elijah did not celebrate. He did not boast. He knew what escalation looked like. He had lived through it once already. But he also knew that fear, once planted in the right soil, grew fast and tangled. One night, as rain softened the ground and hid his tracks, Elijah stood at the edge of a plantation and watched the house go dark, one lamp at a time. He thought of the man he had been before the war, head down, eyes lowered, surviving one day at a time. That man would not have believed this was possible. Neither would the overseers. As Elijah turned away, thunder rolled low across the fields. It sounded like distant cannon fire. He adjusted the strap of his rifle and moved on, knowing that by morning the story would grow again. Twisted, exaggerated, half true. And that was exactly how he wanted it. Because the overseers were learning something new. They were learning what it felt like to be watched. By the time summer pressed down on the land with its wet, unrelenting heat, Elijah Booker was no longer a man moving alone. He had not meant for it to happen that way. War had taught him the danger of gathering too many people around a single idea. Leaders drew fire. Symbols invited destruction. But fear had already been moving through the countryside before him, and where fear moved, people followed whatever stood against it. They began arriving at dusk. Sometimes it was a single family, barefoot children clinging to their mother's skirts, a father carrying everything they owned in a sack slung over his shoulder. Other times it was groups of men who had worked different plantations but shared the same bruises, the same hollow look behind the eyes. They did not announce themselves. They simply waited near the tree line of the creek, watching, listening, until Elijah stepped into view. "You the soldier?" one of them asked one evening, voice low. "I was," Elijah answered. "That's enough." They were camped that night in a stand of cypress trees near a slow bend in the river, a place Elijah had chosen because sound traveled strangely there. Frogs croaked loud enough to mask footsteps. The ground stayed damp, swallowing tracks. The air hung heavy with rot and life mixed together, just as it had in the swamps where he had once hidden from patrols during the war. Elijah did not give speeches. He never stood above them or spoke like a preacher. He listened first. He let them tell their stories, one by one, while he cleaned his rifle or checked the perimeter, as if their pain did not require ceremony to be taken seriously. They told him about contracts that turned into chains the moment ink dried. About night riders who wore hoods or familiar faces, depending on what frightened better. About local lawmen who smiled during the day and joined the hunts after dark. About children beaten for refusing to step off a sidewalk. Elijah absorbed it all without comment. When the fire burned low, he finally spoke. "They come because they think you'll scatter," he said. "That fear will make you small." A young man with scars still fresh on his cheek laughed bitterly. "It always has." Elijah met his eyes. "Not anymore." The first thing he taught them was how to stand watch, not the way overseers did, careless, loud, confident that the land itself belonged to them, but the way soldiers did. Rotations, signals, silence, how to listen without straining, how to see without staring. He showed them how to place men where moonlight worked against an intruder instead of for him, how to use distance as protection. "Don't be brave," he said more than once. "Be alive." Some had rifles left over from the war, traded for food or stolen back from barns. Others carried shotguns meant for birds. A few had nothing but knives and farming tools worn smooth by years of use. Elijah did not judge the weapons. He judged how they were held, he corrected grips, adjusted stances, took the time to show them how to reload without panic, how to aim low when hands shook, how to move as a group without bunching together. At night, when the children slept, Elijah sat with the elders and explained something harder. They want a reason, he said. An excuse. If you give it to them, they'll use it to burn everything you touch. So what do we do? An older man asked, his hair gone gray long before its time. We defend, Elijah said. We don't hunt, we don't chase, we hold ground and make them regret stepping on it. The test came sooner than Elijah hoped. On a night thick with humidity and insects, the watchers heard horses before they saw them, a dull vibration through the earth. The frogs went quiet one by one. Elijah felt the shift before anyone spoke. Positions, he whispered. Lanterns flickered in the distance, 3, maybe 4. The riders did not try to hide. They wanted to be seen, wanted fear to do the work before violence had to. Elijah moved along the line, touching shoulders, grounding men who were one breath away from bolting. He caught the eye of a boy no older than 16, hands shaking so badly the rifle rattled. Breathe, Elijah murmured. Watch the light, not the men. The riders stopped just beyond the edge of the clearing, voices carried, loud and mocking. We know you're there, one called. Ain't no soldier going to save you now. Elijah stepped forward just enough to be seen. He did not raise his weapon. Turn around, he said. His voice did not need to be loud. The night carried it. There was laughter from the riders. A man spat. You think you're the law? Elijah held his ground. I think you're outnumbered and too far from help. That was a lie, but a useful one. A shot cracked the air, fired high and wild. It was meant to scare. Instead, it confirmed everything Elijah needed to know. Lantern, he said quietly. One of the freedmen raised his rifle and fired, not at a rider, but at the lantern nearest the group. Glass shattered. Darkness swallowed half the men instantly. Horses reared. Someone shouted. Another lantern went out. Then another. Panic spread faster than fire ever could. Elijah did not order pursuit. He ordered stillness. Shots fired from the darkness, controlled and deliberate, aimed at the ground near hooves, at trees just close enough to convince without killing. The riders fled, curses trailing behind them, confidence shattered. When it was over, no one spoke for a long time, then someone laughed. A short, disbelieving sound. They ran, a woman said, they ran. Elijah looked around at the faces lit by the dying fire. Fear was still there, but now it shared space with something else, agency. The next days were different. Word spread not just of Elijah, but of communities that did not break, places where riders turned back, where overseers sent others to do their work, and those others refused. Children began to play farther from the cabins. Men worked fields with rifles leaning close, not hidden. Women walked to neighboring settlements without escorts, heads high. Elijah knew better than to believe it would last without cost. Sure enough, trouble followed. A deputy rode in one afternoon with a folded paper and a practiced smile. He claimed to be keeping the peace. He asked questions that sounded harmless and felt like traps. Elijah stood behind the line of freedmen and answered calmly. You're harboring a fugitive, the deputy said at last. Elijah stepped forward. I'm not hiding. The deputy's eyes flicked to the rifle, then back to Elijah's face. You're causing unrest. Elijah nodded. Change often looks like that. The deputy left without arresting anyone, but the message was clear. The protection Elijah offered was becoming too visible, and visibility brought attention, from men with badges, from men without them, from men who preferred order even when order meant cruelty. That night Elijah spoke to the group again. They will come harder, he said, not just riders, lawmen, militias. They will say I'm the problem. A murmur ran through the camp. So you leave? Someone asked, fear creeping back in. Elijah looked around, at the men who now knew how to stand watch, at the women who knew how to signal, at the children who slept without crying out in the dark. No, he said, but you learn to stand without me. He began training others to lead, passing on what he knew, breaking dependence before it could become weakness. He showed them how to organize patrols, how to share information between settlements, how to disappear if needed and reappear somewhere else stronger. The idea frightened some. It empowered others. By the time the first real militia began forming in the county, Elijah Booker was no longer just one man with a rifle. He was a pattern, and patterns were harder to erase than people. As he stood watch one night, listening to the quiet breathing of a community that had learned, at least for now, how to protect itself, Elijah understood something the war had never taught him. Freedom was not given, it was practiced, and he would make sure they had the chance to keep practicing, even if it cost him everything. The first militia rode in at dawn as if daylight itself granted them permission. They came from 3 directions, boots thudding, rifles slung openly, badges pinned crooked to shirts that had once belonged to Confederate uniforms. Some wore coats despite the heat, eager to look official. Others carried themselves like men on a hunt, not a patrol. They stopped at the edge of the settlement Elijah had helped organize, horses snorting, eyes scanning for fear. They did not find it waiting. Elijah stood in the open, hands visible, rifle resting against a tree behind him, not surrendered, not aimed. The freedmen stood farther back exactly as he had trained them to do, watching, listening, remembering. The man who stepped forward introduced himself as Captain Harlan, though the title sat on him like borrowed clothing. "You're Elijah Booker," Harlan said. "I am. You're accused of inciting unrest, intimidating lawful overseers, and organizing armed resistance." Elijah nodded once. "People defend themselves when no one else will." Harlan's jaw tightened. "You were a soldier. You should know the war is over." Elijah met his gaze. The uniforms changed. The violence didn't. There it was, the moment when words stopped being tools and became weapons. Harlan signaled with 2 fingers. Men shifted their weight. Rifles came off shoulders. Elijah raised one hand slowly. "You take me today," he said, "and this place burns tomorrow, maybe not by you, by someone who sees what you allow." Silence stretched. Cicadas buzzed. Sweat ran down backs and into collars. Harlan hesitated. He had expected shouting. Panic. A mistake he could justify. Instead, he saw discipline. Not soldiers, yet, but something close enough to frighten him. "We'll be back," Harlan said finally. Elijah nodded. "I know, they left without arrests, without violence." But Elijah understood the truth the moment the dust settled. The manhunt had begun. He did not stay that night. Before sunset, Elijah gathered the leaders he had been training. He spoke plainly. No drama, no false reassurance. "They will come for me," he said, "sooner than later in numbers." A young woman named Ruth clenched her fists. "Then we fight." Elijah shook his head. "Not like that. If they surround you because of me, I've failed you." "So you run?" another man asked bitterly. Elijah met his eyes. "I move. There's a difference." He laid out instructions, routes, signals, fallback places, who would lead patrols, how information would travel, what to do if he did not return. When he finished, no one spoke. Finally, Ruth said quietly, "They'll hunt you." Elijah slung his rifle. "They already are." He left it full dark, slipping into the trees like a shadow that had learned patience. He did not take the road. He followed deer paths and shallow streams, doubling back more than once to be sure he was not followed. By morning, posses were riding hard through the countryside. They came with dogs first, lean hounds trained to follow scent without question. Elijah heard them long before he saw them. He altered his path, wading through water until the cold bit his legs numb. He rubbed river mud into his clothes, into his hands, into the worn wool of his coat until he smelled like the earth itself. The dogs lost him by midday. That night he watched the posses argue around their campfires. He listened to frustration crack their confidence. He noted which men kept watch and which drank too much. He memorized voices. Elijah was back in the war now. Not marching, not charging, but surviving in the margins where armies bled without knowing why. The next day they nearly caught him. A rider cut across his path unexpectedly, forcing Elijah to dive into a ravine thick with briars. Thorns tore at his coat and skin alike. He stayed still for hours, breath shallow, while men passed close enough that he could hear leather creak and flies buzz around their horses' eyes. One man dismounted not 10 feet away and relieved himself, cursing the heat and the damn ghost they were chasing. Elijah did not move. When the rider mounted again and left, Elijah lay there longer, letting his heartbeat slow. Pain throbbed in his shoulder where a branch had caught him. He tested the joint carefully. It would hold. He emerged after dark, bloodied but unseen. The manhunt spread. Plantations offered rewards. Towns whispered warnings. Some freedmen were questioned, threatened, beaten for information they did not have. Elijah heard about it and felt the weight settle heavy in his chest. This was the cost. He changed tactics. Instead of avoiding the posses entirely, he let them see him, just enough. A figure on a ridge at dawn. Boot prints leading nowhere. A shot fired into the air from impossible distance. He became not just a target, but a problem. Men began refusing to join the hunt. Others demanded more pay. Some claimed sickness. One posse turned back entirely after a rider fell from his horse in the night, screaming about eyes in the dark. Elijah was careful not to kill unless forced. Death made martyrs, fear made stories. Stories traveled farther. Still, violence found him. It happened near an abandoned sawmill. Elijah was crossing open ground when a shot cracked from the tree line. Pain exploded in his left arm, spinning him down hard. He rolled instinctively, firing once to buy space, then crawled toward cover as more shots followed. Blood soaked his sleeve. His arm burned, then went strangely numb. He dragged himself into the mill ruins and vanished inside the skeletal remains of the building. The posses approached cautiously now, confidence shaken. "Elijah Booker," someone shouted. "You're hurt, give it up." Elijah bit down on the edge of his coat and tore it into strips. The bullet had passed clean through, tearing muscle but missing bone. He wrapped the wound tight, forcing his hand to keep working despite the tremor. He remembered field hospitals, remembered men screaming, remembered that pain did not kill, bleeding did. The posses entered the mill. Elijah moved through the ruins like a memory they could not hold on to. He knocked over beams, fired once to draw them deeper, slipped out a side opening when they rushed the sound. By the time they realized he was gone, night had swallowed everything. He collapsed 2 miles away, fever rising fast. It was Freedmen who found him. They did not know his name at first, only that he wore Union blue and carried himself like someone who mattered. They hid him in a smokehouse, tended his wound with what little they had, kept watch even when it meant risking everything. When Elijah woke, weak and burning, he understood something clearly. The manhunt had failed in its purpose. It had not broken him. It had not broken them. It had connected them. Across counties, across rivers, across fear, people were choosing to help rather than hide, to protect rather than submit. The posses were hunting one man, but they were revealing how many stood against them. Weeks later, Elijah left the smokehouse walking slowly, arms stiff but usable. The manhunt continued on paper, but its urgency had dulled. Too many false sightings, too much expense, too little reward. The legend, however, had grown teeth. Overseers spoke his name like a curse. Lawmen argued about jurisdiction. Freedmen spoke of him not as a man anymore, but as a warning, one earned through discipline and restraint, not chaos. As Elijah moved on once more, deeper into contested land, he knew the hunt was not truly over. It had only changed shape. And so had he. By the time Elijah Booker crossed into the next county, he no longer needed to announce himself. The land did it for him. He saw it in the way plantation roads lay empty at midday, as if the sun itself had driven men indoors. He felt it in the hush that settled over taverns when he passed too close, in the sudden interest white men took in their drinks or boots rather than his face. Fear had learned his shape, even when his name was not spoken aloud, and his name was spoken, quietly, carefully, like a match struck in the dark. They said he did not sleep. They said he could hear horses from miles away. They said overseers who raised their whips felt their hands go numb for days after. They said the Union had sent him back alone to finish the war properly. None of it was true. What was true was simpler, and more dangerous. Elijah kept moving. His wounded arm healed slowly, stiffness lingering no matter how much he stretched it. Pain reminded him of limits, and limits kept him alive. He favored the arm without shame. Pride had no place in survival. He adjusted his rifle work, trained himself to shoot clean with his right, to reload by feel alone. The war had taught him that adaptation was not weakness. It was intelligence. Freedmen sought him out now, not just for protection but for instruction. They came with questions instead of desperation. How do we keep riders from isolating us? How do we warn the next settlement without being followed? How do we protect ourselves without giving them a reason to call us criminals? Elijah never stayed long enough to become the center of any one place. He learned that lesson early. Where he lingered, danger followed harder. Instead, he stayed long enough to teach, to organize, to leave behind something that would function without him, a pattern. In one settlement, he helped establish a night watch system that rotated unpredictably so no outsider could learn it. In another, he showed them how to map patrol routes not on paper, which could be stolen, but in shared memory. In a third, he helped a group of women form a signal network using laundry lines and lantern placement, so warning could travel silently and instantly. It was never about weapons first. Weapons were last. It's harder to attack people who aren't confused, Elijah told a group gathered under a stand of oak trees one afternoon. Order is louder than guns. They listened, not because he demanded it, but because his calm carried authority earned in blood and restraint. As his influence spread, overseers retreated in subtler ways. Some claimed they were ill. Others hired replacements and stayed indoors. A few tried to adapt, lowering their voices, keeping their hands to themselves, pretending they had always been fair men. Elijah watched those most carefully. A man who learned fear without learning change was the most dangerous of all. Plantation owners wrote letters. To sheriffs, to governors, to anyone who might still listen. They called Elijah an agitator, a deserter, a criminal masquerading as a savior. They said he was organizing rebellion, stirring hatred, threatening the fragile peace of Reconstruction. Elijah heard about the letters long before any response reached them. Information flowed more freely now among freedmen than it ever had under chains. Riders could be seen days out. Rumors were tested before being believed. Lies were weighed against lived experience. That frightened the old order more than Elijah ever could. In one town, a bounty was posted, not large but symbolic, enough to tempt the desperate, enough to signal official approval without official responsibility. Elijah studied the notice from across the street, hat low, coat unbuttoned to ease his arm. His name was spelled wrong, the description was vague. Armed Negro male, former Union soldier. That could have been thousands of men. Good, he thought. That night, a young white man followed him. Elijah knew within moments. The boy walked like someone trying to be quiet instead of being quiet. His breath caught too often. Fear made men sloppy. Elijah led him down an alley, then vanished sideways through a narrow gap between buildings. When the boy rounded the corner, panting, Elijah was waiting. "Go home," Elijah said. The boy nearly dropped his pistol. His voice cracked. They said I was worth money," Elijah finished. "You don't want it." The boy stared at him, seeing not a monster, not a myth, but a tired man with a scarred arm and eyes that had seen too much. "I won't tell," the boy whispered. Elijah nodded. "That's smart." The boy ran. Elijah did not move for several minutes after, listening to his footsteps fade. Then he continued on, less visible than before. As the weeks passed, Elijah noticed a change among freedmen that went beyond safety. They were building, not just cabins and fences, but institutions. Schools held in churches and barns, mutual aid groups that pooled food and labor, committees that decided disputes internally rather than appealing to hostile courts. Elijah helped where he could, offering advice on structure and security, but he did not lead these efforts. He insisted others take that role. "This has to be yours," he said more than once. "If it wears my name, it won't last." Some argued, some begged him to stay. He never did. One evening, as he prepared to leave yet another settlement, an elderly man stopped him. The man's back was bent, his hands knotted with age and labor. "They call you savior," the man said. Elijah shook his head. "I don't save anyone." The man smiled, slow and knowing. "No, you remind us we can." Those words followed Elijah for days. They stayed with him as he moved through land that still resented his existence. As he heard whispers of organized resistance forming among former Confederates, groups that would soon call themselves by names meant to sound righteous. As he felt the pressure building again, the sense that something larger was taking shape, the legend was spreading too fast now. Legends attracted fire. Elijah adapted again. He began to fracture the myth. Sometimes he introduced himself under a different name. Sometimes he denied being the man they were looking for. Sometimes he let others take credit for actions he advised but not carried out. He wanted the idea to survive him, not be dependent on him. Still, stories traveled. A plantation where the overseer resigned without explanation. A county where night riders stopped appearing altogether. A sheriff who quietly warned freedmen ahead of time when trouble was coming. Each story bent reality just enough to create space. In a small riverside town, Elijah met a former Confederate soldier who had laid down his rifle and never picked it up again. The man had lost a leg at Shiloh and made his living repairing nets. "I fought on the wrong side," the man said without bitterness. "Don't want to fight anymore." Elijah studied him. "Then don't," the man nodded. "Some of us are tired." Elijah filed that away. Fatigue was another kind of crack in the old world. As autumn approached, Elijah felt the shift in the air, not just the cooling but the tightening. Federal troops were being reassigned. Reconstruction promises were being delayed, diluted, debated. The window that had opened was already beginning to narrow. That was when Elijah made his most deliberate choice yet. He began to disappear. Not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually, intentionally. He left regions that could now stand on their own. He moved farther into unsettled territory where his presence could still tip the balance. He stopped correcting stories about himself. Let the legend harden where it needed to, fade where it would draw too much danger. Overseers still feared him, but now they feared something worse. They feared that even if Elijah Booker vanished tomorrow, what he had started would not. One night, resting alone beneath a sky heavy with stars, Elijah cleaned his rifle and thought of the man he had been when the war ended. Alone on a road, unsure if freedom would mean anything beyond a word. He understood now. Freedom was not a single victory. It was a chain of refusals. Refusals to submit. Refusals to forget. Refusals to wait politely for justice while violence hurried ahead. Elijah slung his rifle over his shoulder and stood, joints aching, resolve steady. The legend would keep spreading. And soon, very soon, it would no longer need him at all. The first winter after the legend took root was a quiet one, quiet in the way forests grow quiet before snowfall, when every sound feels deliberate and nothing moves without reason. Elijah Booker felt it in his bones long before frost touched the fields. He was farther south now, moving through country where Reconstruction had never truly arrived, where federal authority thinned into rumor and then into nothing at all. The air carried wood smoke and suspicion in equal measure. Towns watched him pass without asking his name. Some offered food without explanation. Others closed doors and pretended not to see. He welcomed both reactions. For the first time since the war ended, Elijah was tired in a way sleep could not fix. His arms still stiffened in the cold. Old wounds argued with damp mornings. His beard had grown and gray at the edges. He no longer looked like a young soldier returned from war. He looked like what he was becoming, a man shaped by what he had survived, and survival had never been the same as living. He stayed 3 weeks in one place longer than he should have. A cluster of freed families settled near a river bend, building a schoolhouse from scavenged boards and stubborn hope. Children learned letters there, tracing them with charcoal on scrap wood. Their laughter carried farther than it should have in a land that had learned to punish joy. Elijah helped raise the last beam, then stepped back. "You won't need me here," he told the elders that night. They did not argue. That was how he knew it was time. The danger came quietly, as it always did when it was most serious. No riders at first, no warnings, just a sense of attention, of eyes that did not blink when he moved. Elijah felt it while fetching water, while checking the perimeter, while watching the schoolhouse door swing open and shut in the breeze. He recognized the feeling. Someone competent was nearby. He left before dawn, not telling anyone where he was going. Not because he distrusted them, but because protection had to flow outward now, not inward. If trouble followed, it needed to follow only him. The road he chose ran through low hills and pine scrub, land that offered cover without comfort. He moved steadily, not rushing, not lingering. He expected pursuit. It came 2 days later, not posses this time, not drunken overseers or borrowed deputies. These men moved like soldiers. Elijah spotted them from a ridge just after sunrise. 4 figures spreading out, careful with their spacing, rifles carried with intention. They were dressed plain, but their discipline showed in every step. Former Confederates, most likely. Men who had learned war the hard way and never unlearned it. Elijah did not feel fear. He felt clarity. He led them on a path that bent toward old ground, a place he had scouted months before. A dry ravine with high sides and narrow approaches. He set the field the way he always had, not to win glory but to control outcome. The first shot was his. It struck dirt near their lead man's feet, kicking up dust and certainty. They scattered instantly, returning fire toward where they thought he was. Elijah was already moving, sliding down the ravine wall, using shadow and slope to vanish. The exchange lasted less than 10 minutes. When it ended, 2 of the men were wounded, not badly but enough to slow them. One lay face down, rifle untouched, staring at the sky with an expression Elijah recognized. Shock. Elijah stood above him, rifle lowered. "You can walk?" Elijah asked. The man swallowed, nodded. "Then go," Elijah said, "and take this with you." He fired once, clean, deliberate, shattering the man's rifle stock. "Tell them what you saw," Elijah said. "Or don't. Either way, this ends." The men retreated, dragging their wounded, pride bleeding out behind them. Elijah sat in the ravine long after they were gone, breathing through the ache in his arm, the tremor in his hands. He realized something then, not with panic but with acceptance. If he stayed on this path, someone would eventually get lucky, and luck was not something freedom could depend on. That night, Elijah made his final decision. He would stop being visible, not disappear completely, not abandon the work, but step out of the center of it forever. Over the next months, he did exactly that. He traveled under different names. He dressed like a laborer, a preacher, a drifter. He carried his rifle less openly. He avoided confrontation unless it was unavoidable. When asked directly if he was Elijah Booker, he smiled and said nothing. And slowly, the world adjusted. Freed communities no longer waited for his arrival. They acted first. They defended themselves. They negotiated from strength. They sent word to one another without his help. His lessons echoed in their choices long after his footsteps faded. Overseers noticed. They found fields unworkable, not because people refused to labor, but because they refused to be bullied. Contracts were read aloud. Threats were met with witnesses. Violence brought consequences that spread faster than punishment ever had. Some overseers left. Some changed. Some tried one last time and paid for it, not with blood, but with isolation so complete it might as well have been exile. Years passed. Elijah grew older. He lived alone near the edge of a growing town, working as a carpenter when work was offered, hunting when it was not. Children knew him as Mr. Booker, the quiet man who fixed doors and never raised his voice. Few knew his past. Fewer still guessed the truth. Sometimes men would sit beside him at dusk and talk about the old days, about the chaos after the war, about the fear that once ruled everything. "Elijah Booker," they would say, shaking their heads. "That man scared the devil out of overseers." Elijah would smile faintly and keep carving wood. On one spring morning, he walked the long dirt road out of town, past land that had changed shape and meaning. He passed a schoolhouse full of children reading aloud. He passed a church built where a whipping post once stood. He passed fields worked by people who chose to be there. No one stopped him. No one needed to. At the crest of the hill, Elijah paused and looked back once, not to mourn, not to claim credit, just to witness. The war had ended long ago. The fighting after it had ended too, slowly, unevenly, imperfectly. Freedom had not arrived all at once. It had crept in, defended inch by people who refused to forget what they deserved. Elijah Booker adjusted the strap of a satchel that carried little more than tools and memory, then turned and walked on. He did not leave behind a grave marked with his name. He did not leave behind speeches or proclamations. He left behind something stronger, communities that stood, children who slept, overseers who remembered fear, and freedmen who never again believed they were powerless. That was enough. That had always been the point. The savior of the freedmen walked into history without asking it to remember his face, only his effect.